So, HBO are working on a TV adaptation of Baldur's Gate 3, but not in the way you think. It isn't going to be following the original story of Baldur's Gate 3 that we play in the phenomenally successful game. Instead, it will be taking place after the events of Baldur's Gate 3, which leaves me with so many questions. One of the biggest questions I have is who exactly is this series going to be about? Lae'zel, Astarion, Will, Shadowheart, Gale, Halsin, Minthara, Dirge, and Tav all had their stories wound up at the end of Baldur's Gate 3, but in very different ways depending on the route you took. As HBO's Baldur's Gate 3 is going to be taking place after the events of the main quest have all been tied up, we don't exactly know what ending they're going to go with, or which ending they are going to interpret as being canon might be the best way to put it. Because the ending varies so much based on what you do with your companions, or if you take on the role of Dirge and decide to go full Dark Urge, there really is loads of room for them to experiment with what they think might have happened before the events of the TV show takes place. But here's my thing. The main appeal of Baldur's Gate 3 and why it's seen such huge success is because of its characters. The attachment that players have to these characters and the fact that they want to see their stories through and then go far enough to even buy merch, write fanfic, draw fan art about them, is what made Baldur's Gate 3 such a standout success. So what on earth are HBO going to do without those characters? It could be that they're going to be brought on as almost cameos, like in the Fallout series on Amazon, which is currently enjoying rave reviews for its interpretation of the game. Or it could be an ensemble cast, where we do have actors playing all of the main characters in Baldur's Gate 3, and it's more about how they're brought back together after the end of the events of the game. So to recap where all the characters are, I'm going to keep this spoiler free as much as I can. Lae'zel is fostering a rebellion against Vlaakith, Astarion, Will and Shadowheart all living their best lives, as are Halsin and Minthara, if you didn't kill Minthara in Act 1. Tav, let's face it, is basically only doing what their romantic partner wants them to do, and Gale is busy being a god. Everything that the main cast of characters is doing is very much game ended, last chapter, epilogue territory. The main draw of Baldur's Gate 3, as well as the incredible characters, is seeing the growth that they go through throughout the 3 acts, and we get to grow with them as Tav. That's where a lot of the really compelling story in Baldur's Gate 3 comes in. Lae'zel's childhood and growing up as a child warrior, essentially, Astarion being turned into a vampire, Shadowheart doing all of the memory-altering things that she was put through as a kid, and Gale getting essentially groomed by a goddess. And that's not even taking into account Will's storyline, where although he is empirically a good guy, he is still bound to his patron and forced to do her bidding, causing intense character conflicts within. Will's storyline as a whole really casts a shadow over the entirety of Baldur's Gate 3 for me. I have a video on the channel about how I think Larian treated his storyline incredibly badly and the just general lack of attention they gave him. So when it comes to Will, HBO could actually do something pretty cool and give him the story treatment he deserves. The show itself is being taken on by Craig Mazin, the showrunner for HBO's award-winning The Last of Us series. Mazin claims that he's put over 1,000 hours of playtime into Baldur's Gate 3, and as well as acting as the showrunner, he is also producing it, meaning he's putting a fair chunk of his own money into this project, so you've got to imagine that he feels pretty strongly about it. That in itself is a great sign. It's always good when a showrunner or a producer already has a love for the property that they're transforming into a TV series. In fact, he describes himself as being devoted to D&D, which raises another question. Will the TV show follow any Dungeons and Dragons rule sets? Now, that doesn't mean that I think there's going to be dice rolling everywhere. I actually think it's going to be more like Easter eggs. So, if you keep track of a character during combat, you can see that they only seem to do a certain number of actions, almost as if they have a main action and a minor action, when they're in the middle of trying to kill, maim, or hurt whatever it is that's in their way. Having said all that, I do think HBO have missed a trick in following the events of Baldur's Gate 3 in the TV series. Baldur's Gate 3 as a game has a fantastic story structure that was years in the making, especially, just saying, if you interpret Lae'zel as being the main character. So although I'm glad that that story structure is going to be in the TV series as a prologue to everything that's going to happen, it is kind of a shame that we're not going to see that unfold on our TV screens in the same way that HBO did with The Last of Us. Part of me thinks that HBO might be going in a completely different direction to what we expect. What if they're exploring a story that, instead of dealing with all of the Mind Flayer-y events of Baldur's Gate 3, is actually dealing with the knock-on impacts that had on someone completely ordinary? All of the characters from Baldur's Gate 3 had the Mind Flayer parasite in their brains, which did make them special to a certain extent. However, we didn't really get to see the events of Baldur's Gate 3 through the eyes of anyone who was normal, who was just an ordinary citizen going about their day, whether that was in Baldur's Gate or in a camp on the wilderness. So potentially, HBO's series could be taking the everyman perspective. It could be following a character who just witnessed everything going on in Baldur's Gate and didn't have any direct relation to the Mind Flayer parasite conspiracy theory that actually ended up being true that was going on. I have to imagine that one of the most interesting ways the stories could go is if it followed someone whose close relative, best friend, spouse or girlfriend was taken over by the Mind Flayers, and they kind of have to wrestle with the fact that not only are they dead, but their body was used as an incubator for a species trying to take over the world. Now, Larian have no involvement in this project. As far as we know, no writers who worked on Baldur's Gate 3 are consulting on HBO's TV series, and that's largely because Larian have moved on from D&D properties and are now pursuing their own property, Divinity Original Sin, which got an announcement trailer earlier last year. Baldur's Gate 3, although it's attached very deeply to Larian, is the property of Hasbro, who own Dungeons & Dragons. And I would wager that seeing the runaway success Baldur's Gate 3 had, Hasbro want to squeeze that orange as much as they can, so they are making sure that they bring in their own writers to make the sequel that HBO will essentially be making. One of the things we do know is that Mazin has got in touch with Larian, and apparently he is going to be visiting the studio to get their input on it. But as Larian writers don't appear to be consulting on the project, it's questionable what will happen with any of that. I mean, getting someone's input on it doesn't mean you're going to do what they say necessarily. And unfortunately, because this is something we have to consider with everything going forward from now on, is there going to be AI involved? I really hope not. Sadly, Larian is already using generative AI, but has confirmed that Divinity will contain no AI whatsoever. However, as I said before, Larian isn't involved in HBO producing Baldur's Gate 3, so the real question is HBO using AI, or is it going to? Baldur's Gate 3 has such a passionate fan base, myself being just a small part of it, that you have to imagine that any sniff of AI would be snuffed out as quickly as a Mind Flayer extracting itself from its poor host's body. There was a tweet that asked whether the adaptation was going to be a Zoom call because all of the main characters from the game itself are off doing their own thing. They're no longer a humble party of adventurers. They're very much main characters in their own right now, so it only makes sense for them to be cameo appearances, doesn't it? I just really can't help but think this is really going to be a case where no one who's played the game is going to be entirely happy with the HBO series. We all have very personal attachments to each character in Baldur's Gate 3, and the decisions and choices we made directly affected those characters' futures. So it will feel weird to watch a Baldur's Gate 3 TV series where potentially the choices that we've picked will be completely thrown out of the window, and thus our attachment to the property itself might feel a bit divorced from the TV show. One of the magic things about Baldur's Gate 3 was the amount of agency you really had as a player to affect the story. This wasn't just marketing babble, you could truly change what happened to each and every character based on decisions you made, and sometimes that involved not finding characters at all. Someone I know didn't find Lae'zel in time and she ended up dead, and another one staked Astarion because they found out he was a vampire and like, yeah, of course you'd stake a vampire who you found trying to suck your blood in the middle of the night. Put it this way, I definitely don't envy Craig Mazin for all the work he's going to have to do to try and get the story somewhat in order. The thing is, even though he was a showrunner on The Last of Us, Those games very much happen on rails. They have a predetermined story and there's little to nothing you can do to change that story. Therefore, the narrative is very neatly packaged for a TV show. But when it comes to Baldur's Gate 3, there is so much you could pick up on. It could almost be a mini-series, or just scratch it, a series itself for each separate character, or to be honest, each separate quest, especially when you get to Act 3 and you're dealing with the hag and the painter and everything else going on. I just don't understand how you're going to be able to get an entirely well-received story out of the prologue to Baldur's Gate 3. But hey, that's not my job. One of the things that concerns me the most about this HBO adaptation of Baldur's Gate 3 is what it's going to do with the queerness of the main characters. Look, whether you like it or not, all of the characters have inherent queerness in their identity. Astarion has been confirmed to be pansexual, and all of the other characters enter into relationships with Tav regardless of Tav's gender. Queerness is such a huge part of how characters, especially like Karlach and Astarion, are presented and honestly act in Baldur's Gate 3 that it would be beyond a shame to see this queer culture being erased by HBO. But I've been yapping for long enough. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below, and if you want to see more coverage of this Baldur's Gate 3 TV series made by HBO, then please do like this video and subscribe to Eurogamer. We have a ton of videos about video games coming out almost every single day, and a ton of videos about Baldur's Gate 3, most of them voiced by me, so if you didn't want to rip your ears out during listening to this video, you should check out those Baldur's Gate 3 videos. Now, I am going to go and re-download Baldur's Gate 3 on my Steam Deck just to hear it beg for mercy one more time, so I'll see you folks next time.